seasonality, milder temperatures. They're very windy, so we can get really interesting patterns of wind, and based on the directionality of that wind, we can see orographic rainfall on high islands, and usually relatively few disturbances compared to continents, hurricanes, tornadoes, things like that. So all of these features and the distinct species interactions as a result of biotic disharmony is thought to conjointly have led to the evolution of unique phenotypes for island species, which are expected to be fundamentally different from continental species. And that's the question we're trying to address in my lab. We're very interested in what's the evidence for that idea and how does it affect different kinds of phenotypic traits. So thinking about the function of plants in different contexts, species interactions, but also interactions with the abiotic environment. So plant syndromes, probably something that you've heard of, and there's a number of different predictions associated with what we think this island plant syndrome entails. And those predictions are listed here. So in general, we think that island plants are poorly defended against herbivores, that they lack fire tolerance, that they've evolved large seeds, which results in reduced seed dispersal, that because of few pollinators, they have reproductive self-compatibility and generalized floral morphology, that there's been an evolution of secondary woodiness from herbaceous lineages, and that they are collectively slow-growing and conservative in their resource use. All of these predictions have really compelling examples to support them. And so I think for that reason, we widely discuss these as if they're sort of paradigms. And there's a really nice book discussing these different predictions, Evolution in Isolation, The Search for an Island Syndrome in Plants by Kevin Burns. If this is something you're interested in, I highly recommend this book. It's a really interesting read and a great description of some of these really amazingly weird plants and how they sort of fit into this island plant syndrome. But I also want to point out, now I've shown you the book in profile. It's small, right? There's not that many pages in it. And that's because actually we don't have extensive evidence for any one of these island plant predictions. There's always a few really great and compelling case studies, but they're restricted in terms of the species or the islands from which they've been collected. And if we look at islands in general, across all that heterogeneity that I discussed, we actually don't have compelling evidence for any one of these. They still remain predictions. And that's exciting because it means there's still a lot of great work to be done here. We've been investigating several of these in my lab, but I want to focus on slow growing for today because that's the project that we're doing with Claire. All right, so this is an interesting island plant syndrome prediction because it actually arises from observations between native island plants and invasive plants. So in general, we know, I've already talked about this, that island plants are declining, that they're highly threatened, and that invasive species are really successful on islands. So there's this displacement of the native island plants by invasive plants, largely from continents. And this replacement has led to the prediction that this is happening because the continental plants are outcompeting the island plants, which are vulnerable because they're slow growing. And this stems entirely from observations between native and invasive plants on islands. And I think whenever thinking about invasion biology, we have to remember that there's sort of multiple phases at play. And if the invasive plants are displacing island plants via competition, then we have to be thinking about both how those continental invasive plants establish on islands, and then the nature of the subsequent interactions with the native plants, in other words, the competition. And both of those are really nicely captured by this one idea, Darwin's naturalization conundrum, which I also like because it presents this in a comparative framework, really thinking about are island plants different from continental plants, and how does that help us understand the success of invasive species anywhere. This idea is not about islands in particular. But the conundrum is that we expect that invasive plants will be successful in communities where there's some functional similarity with the native species already established there, because they have to be able to tolerate those same abiotic conditions. So they have to get through the abiotic filters. But on the other hand, if they're too similar to the native species in the community, then there could be really intense competition and potentially biotic resistance to their establishment and success. So this is the conundrum. We expect the invasive plants to be similar so they can survive and tolerate the conditions there, but not too similar, or the competition with the native species will be too intense. And I think that's really helpful because it puts this in a comparative framework and gives us some predictions about how to investigate it. And like I said, this was proposed for anywhere. It can apply to continental systems and island systems. If we want to apply it to island systems, which we do, I think we have a little bit more work to try to rationalize this. So can we apply this to islands? This is, I think, the way the logic works for how this might help us understand the interaction between invasive and native island plants on islands. So these are the two parts of the argument that are really well supported. So in general, islands have low species richness. Often those are really unique biotas with high endemicity, but nonetheless, for many islands, it's relatively low species richness. And we also know that native island plants are declining, are endangered, and going extinct across islands everywhere. That's also very well supported. So the question is this explaining this via interactions with invasive plants? That's what we're trying to understand to use this plant, island plant syndrome prediction. So I think this is how the logic works. So because of the low species richness, we think that that can then lead to the availability of niches in those island communities, unfilled niches, because of the low native diversity. And that the niches, the lack of totally filled niches means that there's weak competition among the native species, and that has then led to the evolution of traits in the native species that are not conducive to vigorous growth and high competitive ability, the consequence of weak competition, and that because of that, when continental plants come in that are vigorous and have rapid resource usage, they're able to easily outcompete the native plants that lack those traits, and that's how we get this decline of native plants and the success of invasive plants from continents. That's the model. If you're scratching your head about this, I think that's okay. I'm not totally convinced either, and we'll come back to this. But this is the rationale for how we think island plants have slow growing as part of their syndrome. All right. So is there evidence for this prediction that island plants are generally slow growing, weak competitors, and that explains their displacement by invasive plants? Well, I think what's usually cited as evidence is simply the observation that native island plants are declining and invasive plants are highly successful. That's a global pattern, and it's often used as evidence that this underlying competition is what's happening. But of course, this is indirect evidence, right? Lots of interactions and dynamics and complexities could be actually driving the decline of island plants and their replacement by invasive plants. So the pattern alone is not really giving us that mechanistic evidence that we might want. Competition experiments would probably be more direct evidence. And competition experiments are super common. This is a really useful tool and approach for examining pairwise or even community scale interactions and resource use dynamics. And there's been a really nice meta-analysis from 2016 in Nature Plants, where they synthesized all the evidence from these kinds of pairwise competition experiments, using both greenhouse experiments like this, but also field experiments. And they analyzed all that to test the question of whether the identity of the competitor matters. And what they found is that identity does matter, that when the neighbor is an invasive species, that has a negative effect on the growth of native species, but not vice versa. So native plants don't suppress the growth of invasive plants, but invasive plants suppress the growth of native plants. That's evidence that invasive plants can outcompete native plants. And this is a global meta-analysis. So we thought, well, by the island plant syndrome prediction, we'd expect the intensity or magnitude of these negative effects of invasive plants on native plants would be even stronger for island systems than they would for continental systems, right? So we downloaded their data set and we assessed those 1,241 effect sizes. 62 were collected from island systems, which includes just a few archipelagos, so it's not very broad representation. And we reanalyzed the data. So the effect size they use is Hedges D, and a negative Hedges D indicates that the neighbor has a negative effect on focal plant growth. That's competition. If it's a positive Hedges D, that would indicate that the neighbor actually has a positive effect on focal plant growth. That's facilitation. So in general, we see that a lot of the effect sizes are negative, and across all the studies of just island versus continent, we find that the intensity of competition is stronger on islands than continents. This is a statistically significant difference here. But when we look at the identity factor, we actually see that that's driven by competition among native species. So the intensity of competition from a native neighbor to a native focal plant is much stronger on islands than it is on continents, indicating that maybe competition isn't weak among native island plant communities. And our key question, actually, which is whether invasive plants have stronger effects on native plant growth on islands compared to continents, we couldn't even test because there wasn't a single example of that kind of experiment. So we lack any experimental evidence that competition between invasive plants and native plants is strong or weak or anything from islands. It's simply a really important knowledge gap. And I like to highlight, this was a project done with an undergraduate student. I'm really happy for her. She did an amazing job, and it's always fun to publish with undergrads. All right, so far we have yes evidence lacking. The third kind of evidence that might support this prediction that island plants are slow growing and conservative use could be informed by functional trait approaches. And this is a really widespread approach. It's really useful. It's easier to do than running competition experiments. We can collect functional trait data, and from that infer things like resource use strategies, growth rates, and potentially competitive vigor. So this has been done extensively in the context of plant invasions. And we know that in general, invasive plants do tend to be more vigorous or faster in their resource use strategies. So invasive plants tend to have large and thin leaves, high leaf nitrogen content, fast photosynthetic rates, high conductance and transpiration, low water use efficiency, and that translates into fast growth and high fecundity. These are pretty well documented and supported patterns. But this is for invasive plants everywhere. So it's not specific to islands, but just in general, this is what we think is sort of the island plant phenotype. So this is now then the context that we're going to move into my system in Hawaii to investigate using the functional trait approach, whether there's evidence that there are functional trait differences relevant to competition between the native and invasive plants in the islands. So there's my question. Are native Hawaiian plants more conservative in their leaf economic functional traits than invasive plants established in Hawaii as a way of testing this prediction that the island plants are conservative and therefore slow growing and thus easily outcompeted by continental invasive plants? Working in Hawaii is pretty dreamy. It's a wonderful place to live and to work. It's the most isolated archipelago in the world. So it's actually the same end of these types of island characteristics that I discussed. 90% species endemism. There's a little over 1,500 native species, which are the result of only 259 colonizing plants. So lots of in situ diversification and speciation, which is how we get such high endemism. But it's also a place with a ton of global threats. And there's a lot of invasive species that have now established sustainable populations in natural areas, almost the same number, in fact. So when you go into natural areas, about half the species you see are invasive. It's also a really rich place culturally, and there's a lot of indigenous knowledge about the plants and their interactions with the environment and invasive species, and all of that provides a really nice context for investigating this kind of question. So we're building on a lot of really nice previous work, using functional trait approaches to try to understand how the invasive plants are altering the native plant sort of community ecology and ecosystem dynamics. But most of those studies focus on just a few species and usually only one island, even maybe one site within that island. So we tried to take a broader approach and expand on that by including a lot of species, 87 species, 55 native, 32 non-native. And we focused on the island of Oahu, which is one of the older islands, and it has a lot of diversity of both native and invasive. It's also where I live, so that makes it easier. But we did sample across all the main islands. And then finally, we explicitly considered the role of ontogeny, which is often neglected in this context, but I think really important because we know that resource use strategies and the likelihood of competition is likely to change dramatically as plants grow up. So these dynamics may be really different at the seedling stage than at the adult stage, which is usually what people are focusing on. So in thinking about how to sample this, we really wanted to be careful about spatial scale. And this is important because if we detect functional traits, say at a large landscape or archipelago scale, that doesn't necessarily inform us about differences in resource use strategies of plants that are relevant at the local scale, which is where competition occurs. And this can arise because of differences in species distributions across the landscape. So for example, in Hawaii, invasive species are particularly common and abundant at the low elevations, which is also where most people live. And to find a high diversity of native species, you generally have to go up to higher elevations. So if we detect sampling at this scale, differences in functional traits, that could reflect that they're simply occupying different environments with different resource availabilities. And it doesn't inform us about the intensity of competition. So we wanted to account for this by explicitly sampling in a nested sense so that we could compare functional traits at sites where the native and invasive plants are co-occurring and potentially competing. So that's what we did. We sampled native and invasives co-occurring at low elevation, at high elevation, and then across these steep gradients. And we did capture really steep gradients. That's one of the nice things about Hawaii is in a pretty short spatial scale. You can go up in 2,000 meters of elevation. You can transition from 400 to 5,600 centimeters of mean annual rainfall, and from 10 to 24 degrees Celsius mean annual temperature in the matter of a few hours. So we can sample across this whole gradient, and that gives us some more nuanced understanding of the role of functional trait strategies in this dynamic. And of course, I did not do this by myself. There's a wonderful team of people who worked really hard on this. It was a massive effort to collect all these data in the field, which isn't easy carrying all this equipment up these steep ridges. And so this was led by Andrea Westerban, who was a postdoc at the time in my lab, and she's now moved on as a postdoc in Australia. And then we had 3 wonderful graduate students who contributed, and all of them were busy in the field and in the lab, collecting and organizing all of these data. And we also had a wonderful team of undergraduate students who were able to contribute at different parts of it. And this is one of the pleasures of working in Hawaii is the young people are really passionate about the plants and conservation. And so it is not difficult to get really wonderful students to go out in the field. They're really anxious to do that. So I'm really lucky to have so many great students to work with. We measured some of the usual traits, the ones that we think are directly involved in resource use strategies, potentially informing us about the intensity of competition between the native and invasive plants. We did focus on leaf physiological traits, leaf economic spectrum, and we didn't collect any root traits, for example. The traits I want to focus on for the results I'm going to show you are these 4 here: photosynthesis, leaf mass per area, and leaf nitrogen and phosphorus content, because those are 4 of the key traits for the leaf economic spectrum. And I don't expect you to read this, but there's our phylogeny. And we tested for a phylogenetic signal to all of our traits, and it was weak or negligible. And so we actually set aside phylogeny for the results I'm going to show you. But when we ran the phylogenetic analyses, we got similar qualitative results. So I think that there's no real problem with that. And here's our prediction. So we expect that the invasive plants are at the acquisitive end of the leaf economic spectrum, low LMA, high photosynthesis, high leaf nutrient content, and that the native plants are at this conservative end of the spectrum, and that that's what's then leading to their weak competitive ability compared to invasive plants. That's a pretty simple prediction. And here are our results. So we did a redundancy analysis, which is a multivariate analysis, which allows us to put a constraining ordinate in there, which in our case is origin. That's how we can contrast the native and invasive species. And we can see that the leaf economic spectrum is supported really nicely. These 4 traits co-vary in the directions that we expect. And we also see, if we look at the centroids, that there is some separation in trait space between the native and invasive species, again, in the direction that we predict. So the native plants do tend towards the more conservative side of the leaf economic spectrum compared to the invasive plants, and that this is statistically significant. However, when you look at the cloud of individual plants, that's hard to see, right? There's a lot of overlap. Both of these groups of species have extensive trait variability, and they're not clearly differentiating in any really strong way. So even though this is statistically significant, I'm not sure it really gives us a strong case for native plants lacking acquisitive individuals or acquisitive species, because they're covering all that trait space. And the trait variability is kind of remarkable within our species pool. So this is just comparing our trait variability to the 2,500 species from that original Wright et al. Leaf economic spectrum paper. And what you can see is that within our species that we sampled, LMA, that we detected 64% of that global range, 100% of the global range for photosynthesis, 87% of the global range for nitrogen content, and we actually surpassed the global range reported by Wright et al. For phosphorus content. So it's really variable. Even though this is a pretty small spatial scale and only 87 species, what they're doing is really variable. And that's interesting. If we look at the univariate comparisons, we can again see this extensive trait variability. Again, we also have statistical evidence or support for the conclusion that invasive plants are more acquisitive. So they do have significantly higher photosynthetic rates and significantly higher leaf nitrogen content, no detectable difference for phosphorus and leaf mass per area. But again, these are really tiny differences, right? It's hard to think that these are differences that really matter in terms of their biology. Same here. And also just tons of variability. So in general, we do have evidence that invasive plants are more acquisitive than natives, but the magnitude of difference is super small, and there's a lot of variation. So I don't think this is really giving us a good answer about the likelihood that these translate into competitive differences between these groups of species. And we're really interested in all this variability. There's got to be some other things going on, right? Coming back to how this fits in with our original model, the idea that island plant communities have unfilled niches as a consequence of low species richness may not hold if within those species there's a lot of intraspecific variation. So particularly for widespread species across environmental gradients, they may fill all the niches because of evolution over time. And we have such extensive trait variation among those native line plants that we're wondering, maybe there really aren't clear unfilled niches within those communities. And certainly some of those native plants have really acquisitive phenotypes. So the idea that they're all slow growing is probably not the case. When we think about those environmental gradients that we sampled across, it's not surprising that we detected so much trait variability, right? We know environment contributes to functional trait strategies, both over evolutionary time and also via plasticity within generations. And so when we think about these environmental gradients, we thought, well, we have to try to account for that somehow. And luckily, there are really nice statistically downscaled climate projections based on historical data for the Hawaiian Islands that can help us account for these really steep gradients. That's the problem. We get really steep gradients over short spatial scales. So we need to have statistical models that can account for that. And there are such models. And so from these, we could extract all kinds of great climate data for the 45 sites where we collected data. And these climate data have to do with precipitation and water availability, also temperature and vapor pressure deficits. And so we ran a bunch of multivariate models with this, and we came out with two axes that explain a lot of the climate or abiotic variability across these sites. One we're calling the moisture axis because it correlated most strongly with soil moisture and humidity. And the second axis we're calling the solar energy because it correlated most strongly with air temperature and potential evapotranspiration. So we then reanalyzed our data, including these two climate axes, to see if that could help us understand differences between native and invasive species. And it did. So interestingly, the trait variation across these environmental axes was not similar for native and invasive plants. And there were even switches across the axis, which is really interesting. So here's the solar energy axis, and here's photosynthesis. And what we can see for the invasive species is really no strong trend with respect to solar energy. But for native species, we see this positive trend, higher rates of photosynthesis at higher levels, sites with more solar energy. And what's important is that there's a switch. So in places where there's less solar energy, so cooler sites, the invasives have higher photosynthetic rates on average than the natives. But when it's hotter, now the natives have higher photosynthetic rates than the invasives. So invasives are more acquisitive here, natives are more acquisitive in these sites. That kind of complexity is really interesting and helps us understand that there's more nuance than just invasives are more acquisitive. So then we ran this for all of our traits across all of these two different climate axes. And I'm trying to sort of organize this for you, but basically, here's the moisture axis analyses, here's the solar energy axes. I'm highlighting in red the traits for which we have evidence at some sites that the natives were more acquisitive than the invasives. And then there were some sites where they had similar, so they converge on similar kinds of trait expression. And sort of summarizing this overall, the basic sense of it is that invasives tend to be more acquisitive in the wetter and cooler sites. The natives tend to be more acquisitive in arid and hotter sites, and they both seem to sort of converge on similar trait expression in the mild climate, sort of in the middle of those two axes. So this is pretty interesting, and it means that the intensity of competition may be really strong in some environments, but not strong in other environments. So this doesn't give us a mechanism that explains all of the success of invasive plants on islands, and instead highlights how this is context dependent, in particular based on climate here, which I think makes a lot of sense and seems realistic based on the different kinds of resource use strategies that we think are probably advantageous under different kinds of environments. So the second two conclusions then from that piece is that whether natives or invasives are more acquisitive and therefore likely to be more competitive in that sense depends on climate. And finally, then coming back to that initial prediction, the island plant syndrome prediction that island plants are weak competitors due to their conservative strategy is not supported at sort of the archipelago scale. May be supported in some environments, but not as a general rule. So I think there's always a number of caveats, right? Like we could potentially be overstepping what our data can show us. So I want to be sure to address those because I think this is a hard question to get at. And we've taken the functional trait approach, but I don't know that that necessarily translates the way we want into understanding competition dynamics. So the first caveat is that we're assuming functional traits inform us about growth strategies of these plants. That's kind of the definition of functional traits, that they correlate with fitness. So I think that's a fair assumption, but we also know that it's not always well supported. It's dependent on the ontogenetic stage of plants, on other species interactions, on resource availability. We're also taking only point estimates. So that could be subject to error, right? The other thing is when thinking about competition between this syndrome and island plants in particular, what people really mean is vigorous growth, right? Competition for space. The invasive plants are outcompeting the native plants for space via fast resource use and displacement. And that's only one definition of competition. Actually, under low resource availability, a more conservative resource use strategy in the long run is probably more advantageous. Of course, I don't know if these systems ever get to equilibrium, but the point is that vigor doesn't always necessarily mean competitive ability. And even though that's the way it's sort of implied in this particular case. This is sort of my biggest concern. We're using invasive plants from continents on islands as a proxy for continental plants, right? The island plant syndrome is really about how native species on islands evolve before invasive species showed up. Comparing them to invasive species from continents is probably not the best strategy because we know that invasive plants are a subset of all continental plants and probably not representative of continental plants in general, because we know already they're very vigorous in fast resource use strategies, et cetera. So what we really want to do is compare native island plants to native continental plants. That would be a better test. And we did try this. We took our native Hawaiian functional traits and we compared them to the GlockNet database. That's the one from the right et al., taking out any species they had from islands. There was a significant difference, but super small reliability, right? So there's still just a ton of variability, indicating there's probably not really a meaningful difference. And then another thing that I'm really interested in is that I think ontogeny really matters. Maybe we're missing the competition dynamic because we're measuring the traits on adult plants that have already established and maybe passed through that competition window. So we've been focusing on the same kind of trait-based approach, focusing on seedlings, and that's much harder to do. So we only have 35 species represented so far, and I don't even have those analyzed, so I can't tell you what the answer is, but I'm really excited to see how the trait differences might be totally different at the seedling stage compared to the adult stage. And then if we cast this all back into our initial model, here's where I think there are some wrinkles in the logic. So first of all, islands have low species richness. In general, that's true, but there are examples of really large islands with high species richness. So it's not uniformly true. Most importantly, I don't know that low species richness necessarily leads to unfilled niches. I think there can be a lot of functional diversity in islands, even if there's not high taxonomic diversity, because of diversification within species. So here's where incorporating intraspecific trait variation is really important, because we can then account for this trait variation or functional diversity that arises within species before they ever speciate, or maybe they're not even going to. And we know in high islands like Hawaii, where species are widespread across these gradients, they have a ton of within species variation. So I think we really need to think again about whether that necessarily holds. And then even if, let's say, there are unfilled niches, I'm not sure that necessarily translates into weak competition among the species that are present, because there can be density compensation, which actually we know for many island systems is the case. So just because there's fewer species doesn't mean they don't have the capacity to produce too many propagules, which then lead to high intensity competition, right? And we know from our meta-analysis that the intensity of competition of native-native interactions may be stronger on islands than continents. I think potentially providing evidence for this operating in islands. And then finally, I'm not sure that the weak competition leading to functional traits associated with slow growth is necessarily the conclusion, because we know competitive ability is contingent on resource availability, so there's some complexity there. We're also neglecting the role of disturbance, which can alter these competition dynamics. And so kind of the whole middle part of this model is still questionable, right? We have pretty good evidence here. We have definitely good evidence here. I'm not sure this is working the way we assume that it does. I think we need to visit these assumptions with more data. And really also we need to keep in mind that whenever we're doing mechanistic work and we focus in on one potential driver of an outcome, in this case, displacement of native island plants, and in my case, competition, that's one piece of a very complex puzzle. And at the same time as those plants are competing with invasive plants, they're also encountering novel herbivores, the lack of native seed dispersals, species that are vegetatively reproducing, new microbial interactions, potentially allelopathy. And realistically, all of these things can be interacting in complex ways to affect native plant performance and potential declines. And it's oversimplifying things to suggest that there's one mechanism that's universally true or even mostly applicable. I think that has to happen in the context of all these other stressors. Because measuring competitive ability of these native plants now with all these other things happening is not representative of their evolutionary history, which is what island plant syndromes is really meant to be about. And in that context, like I just said, this is really challenging because the composition of island biotas is so different now. We've lost many of the species interaction pairs and we've gained new species interactions in islands. And then there's climate change and habitat loss, et cetera. So I think this makes it really hard to address some of these syndrome predictions robustly which doesn't mean I don't think we should do it, but I think we have to always be really careful about inferring historical species interactions and functional strategies in the context of now a really different kind of environment. Oh, I have to go back because this is another really key point. This feature of island species in general is that because islands are small, island species tend to have narrow distributions and small population sizes. And maybe that's one of the really key factors contributing to their vulnerability and potential endangerment and extinction. Not necessarily any one of these, but all of those operating on already vulnerable species. I think that's a really key factor. But we can't give up. There's a lot of work still to be done here. And actually, the slow growing prediction is one of the easiest for us to investigate because it doesn't require a species pair that has gone extinct or has become really rare. And so our work in Hawaii is just one system. So with Claire, what we're trying to do is expand this more globally to more islands to investigate functional resource use strategies of island plants, really to get at questions about the functional trait breadth and the idea that there may be unfilled niches and things like this. And we're focusing specifically on physiological and anatomical traits because those are relatively understudied. Island functional biogeography is a big field with a lot of people doing really great work, but not so much physiology and anatomy, which is really our focus. And trying to link above and below ground traits, which increasingly we're seeing more below ground functional traits, which can help us synthesize between those two sets of organs. I think it's really important to incorporate interspecific trait variation, as I already mentioned. So as much as we can find that, we're including it. And then of course, always keeping in mind that islands are themselves so variable. So we're accounting for area, isolation, elevation, climate, et cetera. And really one of the key outcomes of all of this is to identify knowledge gaps. The most pertinent knowledge gaps are that some islands are relatively understudied while some systems are extensively studied, right? And so finding out where the biogeographical gaps are is really key. And also what kind of traits people aren't studying as much as we think could inform us about these resource use strategies. And all of this comes back to, there are a lot of islands. We focused in published research on relatively few of these, but there's many, many islands out there, and all of them have local scientists who know the plants really well. So where we hope this goes is to get more collaborations with people across all these different islands to collect some of these physiological and anatomical traits that are underrepresented and see how we can synthesize across all these very different islands in terms of the island plant functional trait strategy to address this syndrome prediction. So that's sort of the end goal of all of this. And I hope I have time for questions, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kasey. I think we have quite some time for questions. So people online can tell us if they can hear as well with the questions. So questions in the room, yes.
Thanks, it's great. You alluded to this, but I would think that the enemy release hypothesis would be a big potential player, especially pathogens, because that would be the kind of thing that would decouple traits from growth, where in other words, instead of potential growth, the realized growth depends on the pathogen growth.
Yes. So whenever you put herbivory into the mix, things get messy really fast on islands because most of the native island herbivores are super rare now or extinct, so we don't see them. And there are, of course, novel herbivores that have become really abundant. So the interplay of the continental, could you just repeat the question, please? Yes. The question was about enemy release for the invasive species colonizing islands. Yes? And how that could, pathogens.
Yeah, I'm thinking that over herbivores.
Oh. Yes, I just showed my bias. I don't think about pathogens very often. Let's talk about herbivores for a minute. The end result is that I think these continental plants are meeting some of their continental herbivores and probably pathogens on islands because they have also moved to the islands. And so there's a lot of sort of complexity in I think the real key is what's the historical legacy of these interactions. Island plants are often thought to be vulnerable to the pathogens and herbivores, not because they lack defenses. Of course, they do have defenses, but they have defenses to their native herbivores and pathogens, which have become really rare. And they're now experiencing novel pathogens and herbivores. I don't know of any study that's compared enemy release for invasive plants on islands compared to continents. That's really the key question, if this helps explain their success in particular on islands. I think there's evidence for enemy release in general with regard to specialists, pathogens and herbivores, not generalists, right? They're going to encounter generalists wherever they move. But I'm not familiar with any that have done this across islands. But it's a great question. And I suspect somebody's working on it. This is the natural enemy defense is actively being worked on by a lot of folks right now. But I think it's really hard because the native herbivores are largely gone. So I think we're underestimating the island native plant defenses because we can't characterize those interactions.
So we have questions online, several of them actually. So we'll start with Ophélie Rance. So Ophélie, can you try to unmute your speakers?
Yeah, I'm unmute.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I actually have several questions, so maybe I ask one first. So I was intrigued by the fact that when you compare the acquisitive traits between native and invasive, it looks as if the invasive species do not vary across the climatic gradients, while the native species do. And so I was wondering whether this contrast of who is more acquisitive or not, depending on the environment, is just because the native species are kind of locally adapted and have, life history or trait syndromes adapted to the local climate, while the invasive species kind of I don't know, a kind of generalist phenotype that is about the same everywhere. So is that true, or is it just a wrong interpretation of the data that you showed?
No, that's a keen insight, and you're absolutely right. Actually, the scope of trait variability is less in the invasives than the natives. We have greater trait variability in the natives. And that's been corroborated by some other studies from Hawaii, actually, that the niche breadth of the native plants is much broader than the niche breadth of the invasive plants. And this could reflect their bottlenecks in the invasive plant dynamics when they establish in the lowlands. So they're establishing first in this sort of hot, dry kinds of environments, and then they are still expanding their distribution. So we're kind of getting a snapshot with these invasive species. They probably haven't realized their full potential yet. Whereas with the natives, you're exactly right. There's local adaptation across these gradients with locally adapted populations and species across the whole range. And I think that's really the thing. That's why I was always skeptical of this idea, because when you look at the native plants, they're so variable in their functional traits and their strategies. Of course, we have acquisitive, fast-growing populations and species, and also conservative populations and species.
Okay, so we're going to switch to question in the room, perhaps.
Okay.
Then you can come back. So you had a question, right?
Yes, thank you for the fascinating talk. Two questions, but one of them is very short. In the comparison with BlockNet, you use the whole of BlockNet, or you selected, you try to match phylogenetically or taxonomically with the island?
That's not a small question. It's a tangle, because the Hawaiian plant diversity has a pretty similar origin from the Americas and Australia, and they span temperate and tropical places. So we can't easily find sort of comparative continental sites given this diversity of where the origin of the plants have come from. And I think that's maybe partially unique to Hawaii because it's so isolated. There's not an obvious pair the way there often is for an island. So we did all of it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, in the light of your hard evidence from your data, would you say that you really believe in the classical functional island plant syndrome, or you think it's a little bit of a legend and you are not finding evidence?
My opinion is it's too simplistic, right? I mean, I think that's actually the case for all of the island plant syndromes. We're trying to put islands into a box, and the islands are themselves extremely heterogeneous. So I don't know why we would expect necessarily that evolution has operated in some similar way across all these different types of islands to result in phenotypes via convergent evolution. I'm really skeptical of that whole idea. And I know we have great, compelling examples for each, but that's because that's how they got sort of proposed. I think when we start collecting more data that represents the diversity across islands and the kinds of plants on islands, that we're going to find that there's probably just as much phenotypic diversity on islands as continents, and that there is no single type of phenotype for islands. Yeah.
So we now have another question online by Anna Rodriguez. So Anna, can you please unmute your microphone? And...
Yes, can you hear me there?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation, and sorry that I couldn't be there today. I always love presentations where the result is not what is expected, so it's wonderful. I was wondering about the role of humans there. Because the native and non-native species are not just interacting amongst themselves. So humans are affecting these dynamics as well. They are causing disturbance, and they are adding propagal pressure that could be creating pressures on both the native and the non-native species. And human presence is also very affected by abiotic factors. They are in the lowlands, they are in probably in the less wet areas, and so on. So I was wondering how that third element can affect your interpretations.
Well, without a doubt, humans have totally altered this whole context. And what we're able to test now is already sort of the consequence of centuries of human disturbance, right? I think we've pushed these species really to their edges, and now we're trying to understand how they function after they've already undergone all of this change. And there was actually some really nice historical work that was arguing that if you took native and invasive plants without the context of invasive animals and habitat loss, and you put them in competition, that the native plants would outcompete the invasive plants because this is their environment that they've evolved to handle. So I think humans are inextricably part of this. That said, we did only sample in native habitats for this project. So we specifically went off trail and far away from any kind of massive disturbance and sampled in what looks like forest. So we were trying to capture their function in the most kind of natural context that we could, as opposed to say doing roadside sampling, where obviously then we're getting a really different kind of functional strategy in proximity to say roads or something. But even still, of course, the human element is major. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kasey, for the nice talk. Question, your invasives, are they really invasive in displacing the natives, or are they just exotic?
Yeah, so my habit is to call everything invasive because by the sort of ecological definitions in Hawaii, all the non-native species that are established in sort of natural areas are self-sustaining, spreading, and documented to negatively affect the biodiversity and ecosystem function of the landscape. So I feel very confident there that anybody would classify these as invasives. We do have non-invasive, non-natives in the islands. There's something like 2,000 other species that have been documented as sort of non-invasive, non-natives. Cultivated plants, they've escaped a little bit, but not really into natural areas, et cetera. Those are not part of our sample pool. We include only the ones that are problematic.
Okay, and so if this is about displacements and competition, you would expect that plant size plays a way more important role than all those subtle traits. So what about whole plant traits?
So if we incorporate plant size as a covariate, it doesn't change the models at all. So we've done that because that sort of helps get at the ontogeny piece, which I think is really interesting. And it doesn't explain these, it doesn't help explain these trait differences. I think the reason we use these functional traits is because we think it translates into resource use, sort of how quickly they're using resources as the mechanism of competition. But of course, resource use does reflect plant size, although in our sample pool, it doesn't affect any of the outcomes.
Yeah, but if you correct for it, then you correct for ontogeny, in fact.
No.
Rather than
Because plant size is not ontogeny. Ontogeny is phase change. Plant size is just plant size. And we've included plant size as a covariate. It doesn't change any of the outcome of the results. We've also included whether it's flowering or not to try to capture phase change. That doesn't affect any of the outcome. The ontogeny is really like juvenile, like seedlings versus saplings versus mature plants. And really in the field, we're collecting data from mature plants. The seedling part was separate.
Yeah, but what I try to say is that maybe competitive ability is determined by the amount of leaf area ratio that you have, rather than the leaf mass per unit area. So that kind of whole plant traits maybe better reflect competitive ability than a component of that.
Yeah, that's one of the constraints of the functional traits. And we didn't collect leaf area ratio or anything like that. Yeah.
So thanks. We have another question from Colline de Vautour. Colline, you can tell us your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Kasey, and hi, everyone in the room. Thank you so much for this presentation. I have to say, I put my question there in the spur of the moment because I'm a soil microbial ecologist. So I'm very, very far away from what you do, and maybe it's not relevant, but I was wondering, what do you think about the role of the root traits? It might be way too complicated to include in those kind of studies, but what do you think about root traits for this competition between invasive and native species?
Yeah, thank you. That is a good question. And I think without a doubt, root traits play a really important role. There's a lot of interesting complexities below ground that we've totally missed by focusing entirely on the leaf traits. And so we don't really know what the potential role of roots in the resource use, but also things like allelopathy, even measures of growth. We're not capturing the below ground growth. So I think that's a really important limitation of focusing on the leaf economic spectrum traits, which is why in our synthesis, we're really paying careful attention and actually doing separate searches to try to find root functional traits to incorporate. But of course, there aren't as many, so we're constrained a bit. But I think without a doubt, that's an important future direction.
And it's interesting, thanks. And it's interesting as well, it made me wonder, of course, still because of my specialty, how the native associated organisms with the plant could contribute or not to the invasion, let's say.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some nice work done on mycorrhizae, and it does play a role in the invasion of some species. I think in particular, pine invasions have been attributed to the co-invasion of their mycorrhizae on the island of Maui. So I don't know enough about that work, and actually a lot of it's quite new, trying to disentangle native versus non-native soil microbes and how that's influencing this interaction. But I definitely think it's important.
Yeah, I know that was very far away, but thank you so much for your answers.
Thank you.
Okay, Eric?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very nice talk. I kind of agree with Lawrence that actually probably size is much more related to competitive ability than just the leaf economic spectrum. That's my feeling. But in terms of design, don't you think you could have more information if you would actually, as you said, stratify your design, going in lowland where there is more disturbance, and in highlands where there is less disturbance, and then compare within the disturbance site, invasive and non-invasive, and in disturbed site, non-invasive and invasive. I think the focus is probably more on disturbance in this case, because as you said, probably invasive will come in more disturbed sites, and that could take that into account probably more straightforward than just having a global comparison of all invasive against all non-invasive.
Right, so that's exactly what we did. We did stratify it so that within these 45 sites across that elevational gradient, we sampled native and invasives within sites, and we account per site within our models. So it is making the comparison within sites as part of the analysis. So that we agree entirely that you have to look at these interactions at the local scale and then try to generalize that across the landscape scale. We really tried to not confound elevation with disturbance because we wanted to be able to investigate climate as really a major driver of this. And so we were careful in even lowland sites to sample undisturbed habitats. So, I mean, I think you're right, even still, there's probably a legacy of disturbance more at low elevations than high elevations, but we did specifically try to avoid proximity to towns, farmlands, things like that. And actually sampling on the other islands really helped us achieve that because say on Hawaii Island, low elevations are much less disturbed. And so some of our low elevation sites come from those islands. Oahu is quite disturbed at low elevations.
But maybe you could go even to the edge of the disturbance, very disturbed sites.
Yeah.
And you could probably see whether the invasives are there probably, and see whether they really outcompete the.
Yeah, we're not actually totally interested in the invasion biology part of
No,
this.
it's a comparison.
Yeah.
Comparison. I think if we could compare on maybe on broader gradient, you could have some more information.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, so we're still a few questions online. I think we should stop for the sake of time.
Sure.
The talk was very clear, so lots of discussion. The good point is that you'll still be here for
6 more weeks.
6 more weeks, so she's around.
Yeah.
And,
Thanks, everybody.
and just so next week there's no seminar because it's the Pont d'Ascension, and the one after would be the Tyler conference by Ruth Shaw. So keep in mind that you can contact her. She'll be there for a few days. Thank you.
Your help.
Yeah.